One of the other things in this is that they said when the law was first imposed that it would not be applied retrospectively. I don't know because I don't think any of us know whether the articles that are being cited in the case of Apple Daily were articles published before or after the national security law. But what I do know, just one personal example, is I wrote for every week for the last 1 year until last week. I wrote a weekly column for the English language section of the Apple Daily's website. And they never once changed what I wrote. They never edited me, censored me, told me what to write, except on one occasion where after the first police raid of the Apple Daily newsroom in August last year, I wrote a piece mostly paying tribute to the Apple Daily staff for their extraordinary courage and then saying what the international community should do in response. And I had a couple of lines on sanctions, saying that we should have targeted sanctions. And the Apple Daily editor, not the editor of the newspaper, but the editor that I dealt with, came back to me and said, "We love your article, we agree with it, but we're really sorry that this one sentence is a real red line under the national security law, and we will be in real trouble if we publish this." And I said, the last thing I want to do is get you into trouble, so I can just take that line out. And they said, great. And so they ran the piece. So in other words, they were sensitive in that example to the fact that calling for sanctions would breach the national security law. So my suspicion is that the government's accusation that they were calling for sanctions probably relates to articles published before the national security law. And if that's the case, and the law is being applied retrospectively, that's very concerning.
Well, that's the thing about this. Like, they obviously Apple Daily tried to not cross any obvious red lines. It doesn't matter. They had it in for Apple Daily from the beginning. And kind of like what Shelley was mentioning about how people try and find like, oh, what specific articles have people violated? None of that matters because they've created this like vague rule system that they can do just whatever they want. And as long as people try and play by the rules, it'll never work. You just have to recognize that the Chinese regime is a horrible, brutal, bad.
When you say people will try to play by the rules, you're talking about, people outside Hong Kong,
yeah, they try and
companies
work within the framework of how the Communist Party sets up the game. You just got to jump out of that and say what it is, that the Chinese Communist Party is an illegitimate gangster regime and just not play by the rules.
Imagine if the U.S. did that.
The Communist Party would not be able to do this, which is why I think Hong Kong is such a big issue for the Communist Party. I mean, because it's really kind of proving that there's not a whole lot the international community can do to rein in the Communist Party when it wants to do something.
I think that there's a lot of truth in that, but I also think there is a lot more that the international community can do that it's not yet doing. Perhaps it's starting to. I mean, there are signs that countries are finally waking up. But I think, I think if there is a much more coordinated and robust effort by the free world, the democratic world, that could result in pressure on the Chinese Communist Party that could rein it in.
It just people need to start treating the Communist Party like an illegitimate government. Yeah. So you can't have like Angela Merkel saying, well, we need to sell cars in China.
Or the Olympics.
Yeah,
I was reading Dominic Raab, the UK foreign minister, had tweeted this thing about how, the closure of Apple Daily shows the restrictions on freedom in Hong Kong, that the national security law wasn't supposed to happen, but happened. And I was reading this and thinking, but it's good that he said this, but can the UK actually do anything about what's happening?
Well, I actually retweeted his statement just about an hour or so ago and said exactly the same thing that you've just said. I said this is a very welcome statement, but statements alone, however strong they are not going to cause the Chinese Communist Party to rethink. We need action, and specifically we need targeted sanctions. and the UK has not yet applied. It's applied a handful of sanctions in response to the situation in Xinjiang. But even then, they didn't sanction the party's secretary, Chen Quanguo, who's responsible for he's really the architect of the intensifying persecution, arguably genocide of the Uyghurs. So he's not on the sanctions list, but they haven't applied these sanctions at all in relation to Hong Kong. So I think that's really my point that I was making a moment ago, which is that we can't just keep having statements. We need coordinated, robust action.
And when you say targeted sanctions, you mean kind of what the United States has done?
Yes, absolutely. I think the United States has set a very good example in that regard. And I think that if other countries followed and did it together, because I can understand, the UK or Canada or some European countries might not want to act alone and therefore risk retaliation from Beijing specifically against them. But if they all act together, is Beijing going to retaliate against everyone together? Well, maybe, but there's safety in numbers. And so I think countries should follow the US example.
As far as the UK goes, the UK was essentially responsible for giving Hong Kong to China, including Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, which arguably never really belonged to China. But then the UK basically signed this, I don't know if you call it a treaty or a legally binding agreement, but whatever it was for the handover in 1997, doesn't the UK have a special obligation or a special role to play in terms of dealing with this broken promise?
Oh, yes, it definitely does. I mean, it has a special responsibility, both for historic and moral reasons, but I would say for legal reasons as well, as a signatory to the Sino British Joint Declaration, which is an international treaty. It's registered at the United Nations. I mean, the weakness of the Sino British Joint Declaration is that there's no enforcement mechanism attached to it. So when it was drafted, there was nothing in there saying what could be done if one party breached it. But nevertheless, the UK definitely has an obligation to speak out and to act in whatever ways it can for Hong Kong.
Why do you think there was no enforcement mechanism put in place?
I think it was probably naivety on the British side that they this concept of one country, two systems was proposed by Deng Xiaoping, proposed by the Chinese side. It sounded good, and I suppose at the time people thought, we have reason to believe that they'll honor it, and they didn't seek to look at the consequences if it wasn't honored.
I mean, it was still several years before they started to breach it.
It was
2003, right? Yeah,
that was the first big one.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I lived in Hong Kong for the first 5 years after the handover, from 1997 to 2002. And I would say that when I left in 2002, I left reasonably optimistic that Hong Kong was doing okay. Not perfect, but doing reasonably well. One country, two systems was broadly intact. The basic freedoms that people enjoyed were there. And if anything, the subtle violations that I did see, I worked as a journalist there, and on the newspaper that I'd worked on, when it was bought by a Hong Kong tycoon, Charles Ho, about halfway into my time on the newspaper, it started to change course. It had been a very pro-democracy, sort of free-speaking, critical, independent publication, and it became much less so. But I saw that as not so much Beijing's intervention as more self-censorship on the part of the proprietor and some of the editors. And it was really, apart from 2003 and sort of creeping erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms in subsequent years, the turning point, I think, was the 2014 umbrella movement. And it was from then on that we really saw the increasingly rapid destruction of Hong Kong's freedoms.